Obviously, very important to this council is the Orari Ōpahi Parirora zone, the OTOP zone. Within each of those 10 water zones were established a CWS water zone committee. So at 2010-2011 we established 10 water zone committees. And these committees, as you're likely aware, are joint committees of both the relevant district or city council and Environment Canterbury. They have elected members from each council, along with the Runanga appointees, representatives, and between 4 to 7 community members with the option of youth representation as well. They're facilitated by a facilitation team that sits with Environment Canterbury to ensure we have kind of consistency, but to help boost capability across those. Now, what these groups did over the first 5 to 10 years was a significant amount of heavy lifting to develop solutions to local freshwater issues within each of these water zones. So there was extensive work with local community groups, with catchment groups, with councils, and they identified these zone implementation programs, or otherwise known as ZIPs. And these are fulsome documents. If you haven't seen one, they've got they outline the key issues. There might be up to 100 key recommendations that sit within them, and they played a really important part in informing, particularly Environment Canterbury's regional RMA plan making. So the Land and Water Regional Plan and some of the sub-regional plans that were made under that. And so that's where there was a lot of purpose to the committees. We had a lot of buy-in from the community to that work, and they were highly effective. Since they've moved on from that, there have been questions coming around what's their ongoing purpose. And so they've very much shifted into supporting some of the implementation work. And the committees have about $50,000 per committee to allocate towards local projects to support delivery against CWMS goals and targets. That shift from strategy through to implementation hasn't been smooth, and I think somewhat unfairly, councils expected zone committees very much be in the implementation space. However, with $50,000 to allocate, and it wasn't a nice fit. And so over the last 5 years in particular, there have been a number of questions, concerns around what's the ongoing role of zone committees. There's been shifts in national direction, what's their purpose, and just some concerns around the operation of those. And those concerns have come from a number of parties, including councils, regional council, mana whenua, and some community groups. However, in saying that, we do know that there's, and this makes this work somewhat kind of challenging, is that there's a lot of variety across our zone committee. Some work particularly well, some work okay, and others haven't worked so well. And a clear example of that is in the Hurunui, in which they decided to disestablish their zone committee in 2021. So that kind of sets the scene for the zone committees and sets some of the challenges that kind of leads us to where we are, or where we were at the start of 2024. So because of that kind of evolving nature of freshwater management policies, concerns with regard to zone committees, the Mayoral Forum initiated a review in early 2024, and that's what my team's been leading within Environment Canterbury. And 2024 really was a year of engaging with each of the zone committees on a number of times, workshops, engaging with mana whenua, CWMS Runanga representatives, engaging with each of the Canterbury mayors to actually understand what's worked well, what hasn't worked well with regard to the zone committees, and start teasing out where should we go next if we want to continue providing local leadership on freshwater issues. And so as part of that, the Mayoral Forum also identified or established a working group of mayors, Runanga chairs, and Environment Canterbury councillors, in particular the chair of Environment Canterbury. And Mayor Bowen has been on that group, and we've had 4 sessions of that group, and I'll talk shortly about where they've got to, but that's been a really valuable mechanism in which to take this work forward with some of those key partners. So I talked about all the work that was undertaken, kind of engaging and testing and that that first stage was completed with the Mural Forum report in November of last year, and that's been sent out to key parties. And essentially, the Mural Forum endorsed a number of key items that we've got up here. First of all, zone committees are no longer the preferred approach in some areas, but noting that others do work well. And so that was kind of, the discussion was around that there is a need to kind of refine and think about what comes next after zone committees, but at the same time, not unnecessarily disrupt some of those zone committees that are working well. And if you go to Kaikoura, for example, Mia Mackel up there will say their zone committee works quite well and they don't want to see too much changes. However, you will go elsewhere and they'll say, well, they don't really see a need for a zone committee anymore. What the Mural Forum also endorsed, we started to think about, well, what comes next, and it was really identifying that local leadership on freshwater issues remains critical if we're to continue supporting freshwater outcomes and to achieve the often ambitious but goals associated with the CWMS. And so that local leadership, the Mural Forum endorsed, should be based on a base model that locally connects councils, district, city, regional council with mana whenua at the leadership level. The Mural Forum also endorsed that CWMS fundamentals and guiding plans remain critical, and so we talked a little bit about some of those key principles that underpin the CWMS, but also the heavy lifting that is reflected within zone implementation plans. And then the Mural Forum endorsed that further work was necessary to refine that, set up the working group, and finally that they would like to see a final report produced for the Mural Forum in May 2025. So that's next month, towards the end of next month, and so that's what we're working to. And along through this process, we've been updating zone committees and staff at territorial authorities, largely through some of the forums that sit within the under the auspices of the Mural Forum, such as the Canterbury Policy Forum, which is a senior managers group. Now, I've got a couple of slides here just to talk about this proposed local leadership group or the local leadership groups, because this is where the Mural Forum's been thinking about what should local leadership look like in the future. I've talked about locally connecting councils and mana whenua at the leadership level. One of the tricky things here is, given the variances across Canterbury, the differing kind of perspectives across councils, but also actually across Runanga as well. So we're looking at to see what's the base level there that can actually be built on locally. And so the core membership and function, we kind of want regionally consistent. When we think about what the purpose of these things might be, it's really around like priority setting and promotion or oversight of action. And I'll talk to this on this next slide here, because what we've been talking about here is prioritising, aligning and recommending. So how can these groups at a leadership level start prioritising key actions, thinking about how to break down from 100 recommendations to 3 or 4 that could be delivered over a course of a year or 18 months. Align align some of those recommendations with what's already happening within the community and the catchment groups that are doing amazing community-driven action. And then importantly, how can they recommend actions back into councils to inform long-term plan and annual plan process? Because this is one of the things that zone committees did very well in initial days. They made recommendations back into council, particularly with regard to planning. We see there's still a key role that these local leadership groups could play in identifying key local actions that need to be kind of progressed and then making recommendations back into council's long-term plan process. And then what we've also been hearing through the engagement that we've been having to date is that this connection to community remains critical. Yes, we've been kind of framing it as a 3-legged stool with regional council, mana whenua and territorial authority, but we're absolutely hearing from a number of councils that some form of community connection is important, and there's varying views on whether that should be formalised through sitting at the same table, or it should be done through community advisory groups, or whether it should be done on on kind of town hall meetings every once in a while to actually understand what work is happening at place and what are some of those key priorities. There's also a real opportunity here for these local leadership groups when they're identifying key issues that need to be progressed at place, engaging with central government agencies, and it's quite a powerful forum if you have all councils with mana whenua aligning on particular issues and taking messages to central government agencies, but particularly DOC and LINZ, who are a significant land holder, land manager in Canterbury, and so that's where some of the kind of opportunities sit there. I've already talked through a little bit this diving into purpose, but what we keep on hearing is how do we better prioritise action? How do we show our community that we are delivering to some freshwater outcomes, doing fewer things well? How do we make sure that we're not overriding or overlapping with some of the great work that's already happening with the community, and how do we align with that? And to give these things some form of teeth, how do we better recommend a course of action back into councils? So that's where we'd got to about a month or 6 weeks ago. Since then, we've had 2 more working group sessions with the group of mayors and Urunga representatives, and we've been working through a number of key questions because these were still unresolved. However, we have been making great progress. The first of which is, what scale should these groups operate at? And so I talked to Canterbury having CWMS 10 CWMS water zones, but we also have district boundaries in place. But importantly, we also have proposed freshwater management units across Canterbury that were developed as part of the draft regional policy statement that provide, that are more based on kind of hydrological connectedness across Canterbury. And so part of the question that we've been working through the working group is if we see local leadership as ongoing local leadership as critical to address some of the freshwater challenges we have, at what scale should that be? And so they've been chewing through that problem. Or that question. The second one here is on scope. Obviously, zone committees have been very much focused on freshwater management, ecological health, but also, which includes some biodiversity focus. There's been questions raised about whether these groups should also have a biosecurity focus, natural hazards, etc. Because in Canterbury, we not only have zone committees, we also have biosecurity advisory groups across Canterbury, or 4 of those, and we have some kind of biodiversity groupings as well. So is there an opportunity to have a line and create some efficiencies there to reduce costs both to councils and to the community in mana whenua? We're working through some key questions around mandate and structure. So zone committees have been joint committees of councils. So the OTOP Water Zone Committee is a joint committee between this council and Environment Canterbury. Is that, do we want that to continue, or do we want to move to something else, such as a voluntary partnership? We have a number of different examples across Canterbury that we can kind of look to, which are based on voluntary partnerships, collaborative agreements. We have a co-governance arrangement in Te Waihora, Lake Ellesmere. So that's been the other question that the working group's been working to. And lastly, but kind of very importantly, is how should these groups set wider community membership? Should community membership be for elected, should that be seen as elected council representatives? Should we be opening the door for other community representatives? Should we be opening the door and opening membership to key community organisations or statutory agencies? And so that's what the group's been working through. This is very fast, and I hope I'm making sense, but I really want to tee up a good conversation with you after this. So just with regard to where we're at next, the slide is now a little bit out of date because that first bullet, we've had those 2 workshops, which we had one yesterday, and so we've completed those workshops. We are 90% of the way through discussions with territorial authorities. We've got one more tomorrow, which is Kaikoura, and so we've been meeting with each of the district and city council over the last four weeks, and we're also had some conversations with Runanga, but we haven't had all of those. And then we're also engaging with staff across all councils via the Canterbury Policy Forum. Zone committees, in the meanwhile, have been continuing to work, although there has been a bit of a wind down while this process plays out. So zone committees have been finalising their current action plan budget allocation, so that's the $50,000 per year, which they make recommendations back into Environment Canterbury for supporting great projects with community groups, etc. They have been, where possible, informing the CWMS 2025 Targets Progress Report, and so that's quite an important bit of work as well, because alongside the Zone Committee review, we're also taking a paper to the Mayoral Forum in May, which will provide the latest update against the 2025 targets as part of the CWMS. And what that will show is that considerable effort continues to be made. But what it will also show is that we need a lift in effort for a lot of the often highly ambitious targets and goals that we have with regard to improving ecosystem health outcomes across Canterbury. So there's a real opportunity to think, well, how can these new local or the proposed local leadership groups support delivery against those targets? And then zone committees have also been, where possible, advising on local priorities that could be picked up by these proposed local leadership groups. So this is the last substantive slide, and before I'm really keen to hear any feedback from you. But this is the timeline we've been working to, but it's particularly, I've talked to most of it, it's particularly the May and the June dates, which are really important. I'd like to draw your attention to. So next month we'll be taking recommendations to the Canterbury Mayoral Forum on the model for the new local leadership groups. And that's really was the focus of the conversation with the small working group yesterday, with some final advice on kind of those scale, those scope and those mandate questions. And then in June, following on those recommendations from the endorsement from the Canterbury Mayoral Forum, we'll need to be bringing a conversation back to you as a council, because the Canterbury Mayoral Forum can endorse, but they're not a decision-making body. That decision-making sits with you and with Environment Canterbury, particularly with regard to joint committees. And so we'll be coming back with a paper to you to seek the disestablishment of the Zone Committee, if that's where the Mayoral Forum, what the Mayoral Forum endorses, but also the establishment of new groups, these new proposed local leadership groups. Now, what we don't have up here, obviously, is a key date in October that I know you're all very aware of, local body elections in October 2025. And so we're working through that. So there's not an intention to establish and set up these new local leadership groups ahead of that, given there will be changes around council tables. But it's to get the commitment to it, so then we can actually start putting some of that foundation and the structures in place to ensure that once we do have these new local leadership groups fully with membership after the election, we'll have a set of advice around what priorities they might want to select from, what kind of timeframes they'll need to work to if they're to support or to kind of feed into council annual long-term plan conversations, because that's going to happen sooner rather than later. I know next year's a critical year for actually starting doing that initial thinking. And so the June more about getting a commitment to these groups in order to stand them up post the election. So that is me. I'm sorry if that was too quick. I just know we're under a bit of time constraint, but I wanted to leave enough time to hear from you all.
Yeah, cool. Awesome. Thanks, Kim. That's great. And I think you sort of covered it at the end. I think as far as what implementation sort of looked like, and we had that sort of really good slide yesterday, which I think was really helpful for our thinking. And, you know, just to take our team through it, there's those core members. However, I'm probably assuming for the likes of our council, and some are very similar, that the community voice has been very important, and so that would likely to be established I would imagine our membership would be pretty similar to what it currently is, to be fair. And that's all sort of decided at the start, and then it works through. So probably in that's not touched on there. There's quite a lot of flexibility, and I think you sort of alluded to that with the likes of Kaikoura, that are pretty comfortable with the status quo where others aren't even operating at the moment. So, and setting those priorities, but priorities don't just mean projects. I think one of the discussions that we've talked about in regard to policy and legislation is how can these groups sort of influence back up from your bottom up, if you like, into whether it's TAs, regional council, central government, and actually have a bit more teeth. But that's the challenging point. But sorry, I'll open to questions, Stu.
I get freshwater's important, I get we've been part of these groups, but this seems like a hospital pass to me in some ways, because government has told us to focus on key things for our ratepayers, and if these groups want to establish and feed in, fine, but I struggle to see our role in them, because the first thing they'll come to us as a council group and say, where's the money? And there isn't any.
Yeah, look, I can talk to that. I think that part of that is to line up with relevant LTPs, and so that would be sort of the focus of the new committee, going into that, identifying priorities projects again, whether it's regional council or TAs, etc. But if you look at some of the things that are actually happening at the moment, if you look at Waitaraka, how that might line up, if this existed in the next iteration rather than the current, OTOP, how would that help support that? How does this group support the Rangitata? That's probably one thing that we didn't sort of touch on, but those new alignments probably going to have some more focus on those catchments. So Rangitata currently is a bit of a miss, probably for the zone committees. But it's how you influence and work and support those sort of strategies and stuff as well. So, and some of that has, Rangitata, Waitaraka, they've had central government funding and stuff. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I guess I get that feeling. What worries me is it has been central funded, is that money still going to be available? Because what's the push behind the big change? Some of them haven't been operating so well. Why haven't you moved to improve their operation? I'm just lost to why we're doing it.
Yeah, thanks, and it is a good question. The first part of this, the first part of the review that we undertook through 2024 was asking that question, what's needed to improve this? But I think there's a real recognition that the zone committees were set up at a time, 15 years ago, in which the main body of work for them to do was to support, just the identification of local freshwater challenges, and then build that into, or feed that into Environment Canterbury's work to build a regional land and water plan. And so that was a real kind of like a time-bound product. And ever since that dropped away, there's been they haven't been well set up to deliver kind of the next phase. And so I think there's a recognition that quite a shift was needed to make them, to focus on how do we better prioritise local issues. I think the funding question is a good one. We've always been working under the premise of we've got an existing funding envelope and we're not going outside of that with regard to the way in which we set up these new proposed local leadership groups. There's, from a funding perspective, there's a kind of a regional action plan budget. Councils share some of the honoraria costs between ourselves and between Environment Canterbury and Timaru District Council, and not looking to increase any of that. I think the other point I'd make is that some of these kind of priorities won't necessarily just be projects that require money, because I think there's a real opportunity. If I look at a good example is looking at Ashburton Lakes and the work that's been going on there. Sometimes we don't necessarily require a whole bunch of money to go to address something. It can just actually be focusing our people with existing resource at something. or it can be making sure that we're getting our plans and our regulatory delivery right in some areas to deliver out. So it's not necessarily just a money thing, and I really think there's an opportunity to better align delivery with what we do have.
I suppose, Stuart, it's hard to understand unless, you've been on one of them and understand the frustration. I think my understanding and knowledge around OTOP was that it always struggled. It struggled with representation, it struggled with significantly strong personalities, and it struggled with capacity and capability of people, and including consistency of runanga, although Arawhena were a darn sight better than some of the others and what have you, and that's always going to be it. I don't see, although the speak and narrative sounds, like there's change. When you look at it, I don't see a heck of a lot of change between what it was and where you're heading. One of the key fundamentals that everyone was key not to lose, and that was regional TAs and runanga being part of that mix and having that capability, because there were very few forums whereby you could communicate and be part of that. And so I see you're sticking with those. But local community and interest groups are the keys. It depends, you can be hijacked by a whole group of farmers, or you can get hijacked by a whole group of people with who are involved in industry and all that sort of stuff. I'm not saying, how do you lock them in? You used to lock them in because they were, voted on, they had a structure, they had really good structures around their meetings and what they had to do and all that sort of thing, and they had the zip and zippers, although they became something that just sat over there. And they found themselves to be have no real purpose until they had some autonomy when you gave them 50 grand, and then those things were funding all sorts of arbitrary things and what have you. There's a tendency for this to fall into the same area, and it's going to be until we know what does a local community group look like and where's the incentive for those people to come on. That I see that as the hardest thing. And of course, the key things around have always been water quality and land use. Well, central government are telling us actually that's not as important anymore because we're going to restructure the RMA and take a whole lot of stuff out, including some of the real dynamics around compliance. Because I know like two high-functioning ones were Upper Waitaki and Lower Waitaki, and they both had different fundamentals to them and direction and stuff. But likes of Upper Waitaki, they were humming, and they had the farmers on board, and they had people on board, and they had, real agency there in the community and everything. And then ECAN came along and said, "Oh, there's too much strife here. Let's just pull the plug and don't do any more compliance up there." And the farmers all jumped up and down and everything, and it's all sort of lost its way. How will this change it? I'm not sure.
Was that the question?
Yes, that is. It is. How will this change all that when it looks fundamentally the same principle?
Another great question. Just testing me. I think, there's absolutely been a desire to kind of streamline and create efficiencies here. And I think the community representation kind of issue is a good one. And this is where some of that local discretion is going to be, or flexibility is going to be really important. Because, up in Kaikoura, again, as an example, if you talk to the mayor, he would say, well, it hasn't been kind of overrun by community interests. It's been a really good reflection of the interests of the community, that particular zone committee. So how do you kind of enable that good work to happen? However, in other areas, you might say, well, it would be pretty great if there was actually a greater connection and greater leadership or shared leadership demonstrated by the councils and Mana Whenua. And if you could get them together and actually singing from the same song sheet where possible to particular strategic kind of freshwater issues, and that would be quite an advantage as well. We're absolutely kind of trying to design this through the Mayoral Forum in a time where we've got lots of central government change. I kind of quite often reflect back about kind of where some of the concerns around the zone committee. It also came at a time when when there was, government direction around a national policy statement for freshwater management, which was highly kind of ambitious. There was also a Three Waters program of work that I'm sure you all know about, and it was all quite divisive, and it almost took the attention away from the CWMS. But on reflection, it's like, wow, it's pretty good having a Canterbury-driven water management strategy that's been driven through it's been created by your communities and actually can withstand. It's still as sound as it was 10 years ago, the strategy itself. So how do we keep holding on that and making sure we've got the appropriate kind of leadership groups to kind of continue to take that forward? Because it'd be interesting to see what comes out of the resource management shifts, and it might change some of, council's functions, etc. But I'll be surprised if it changes too much, or it'll be interesting to see what kind of bearing it has on the Canterbury water management strategy, the vision, the principles, etc., that we still, across Canterbury, we still hear, including from industry, that there's wide support for it. So how do we kind of retain hold of that and make sure that that kind of is something we can hold, given that there all are these changes from central government, and there will likely be more changes from central government when another government comes into place.
And the only way to drive that, again, it relies heavily on the resources of regional council. And will that be the same? I mean, all the authoritative people in terms of that spectrum and that environmental sort of stuff come out of Environment Canterbury, and the people who administer them and what have you and all that. Is that still going to be there? Is that going to be fundamentally part of it?
Yeah, the intention, and that's the funding, the intention is that we still facilitate these on behalf of the Canterbury Mural Forum, and so that's still there. I'll still have a team of people, kind of particularly over the next kind of 1 year, like supporting these groups as they set priorities, and then supporting the efforts back into councils. But it will require like a bit of a renewed kind of focus, or re-energised focus across all the CWS partners to make sure we can deliver against these CWS targets, because we will see in a month or so that there are a number of these that are heading the wrong way, and we need to continue making effort.
Cheers, thank you.
And Pete, one thing that I think, was considered was, do you scrap them altogether, and then what hold does that leave if you take that away? And then whose role is it, for freshwater leadership across, the districts and, wider Canterbury? And it came back to, actually, those are the sort of appropriate players that should be at the table, the TAs, mana whenua, regional council, community, etc. But I think what was interesting was there was some good agreement between some of the TAs, but also the likes of Chair Pauling at ECAM, that it should be much more than that. And he's probably got a wider scope than anyone. In fact, that he was keen to bring lots of other stuff into it that played alongside freshwater as far as biodiversity and lots of other stuff. But also very open, and obviously, some of the regional policy, et cetera, has, gone by the way with changes, but was very much of the view of how you bring that voice up, that local leadership voice up, to help influence. And for me, I think, and I've gone through different, through thinking through this process on, what's the purpose, but I sort of think, well, if you don't have anyone, and I would be concerned if, we just wanted to jump into this space, because I don't think we'd probably get the buy-in. So I'd rather support, whatever the iteration of, the OTOP is next, some sort of partnership model, whatever it ends up being, to stay in that space, because I think it's still valuable. And, we're what have we talked about today with VT? Water comes up constantly, doesn't it, as far as driving our economies and other things. But conscious.
I'll regret what I say.
Yeah, because we can differ in our views, Nigel. It's okay.
Thank you. Councillor Pye obviously sit on the OTOP Water Zone Committee, and my comments are not directed at any individual on that committee, because we are a committee and all take responsibility. But I think the biggest problem to date has been accountability, and in my view there's none. We have an action plan. We don't very often monitor performance against the action plan. Dave did produce a report for us, but we don't see that every meeting. We're kind of left with this role of dishing out some money to various groups, and we don't even really know if they're the priorities in the area or not. So I've always struggled with that. I can speak from, I think for most people around the table at OTOP, is we're all frustrated because we've kind of lost our way, and I can see some nodding in the back row there. So I think I'm right in saying that. So I think the most important thing for whatever shape we go forward with is the accountability. And who are they accountable to, and how does that accountability work? Is it an annual report that goes to the Mayoral Forum, the various councils, the community? Community input is vital, but I'm not sold on what that looks like. But I think it must have some structure. If you leave it up to some new groups, whatever we're going to call them, it'll happen fantastically, others it may not. So I think that needs to be structured. I think we should go with FMUs and not zones, because as me and Nigel pointed out, Rangitata doesn't have anything. And it makes sense. Why would you have kind of priorities and strategies for this area, and then the FMUs are going to have another one over here? That just does not make sense. It needs to be FMUs. And you question in there about, should it just be freshwater? I'm not so sure about biosecurity and natural hazards, but definitely biodiversity, because I would argue that most of what we're funded is actually. That's my views.
Thank you, and I think you covered brilliantly what was discussed yesterday by the working group without even being there, so well done. Because accountability absolutely came up, and it was, and accountability goes two ways almost, doesn't it? As in, what are these groups doing, but how can, if they are setting kind of priorities that have been kind of tested with the community, and then kind of informing back into council, how can we kind of track progress against those priorities essentially across councils? And so that was absolutely a key focus that came up there. And I think the other one around kind of structure is really important too, because we had, like, there was conversations around what does community represent, or what does community connection look like? I think it was more because everyone noted that community connection is important. However, does that mean community kind of membership within these groups, or does it? So, and there was also a question: should that be set kind of a one size fits all for these groups, or should it be set kind of locally, given the differing needs of the community? And then the FMU was a good one as well, because that's where the working group landed, was based looking at kind of FMU, given that's kind of where the regional policy statement was drafted on, but also that's likely to reflect some of the approach for this future kind of plan making that will need to be undertaken, and which these groups could play a key part in. So thanks for those comments.
Awesome. Anything further? You didn't want to?
No, just, I'll sort of back up Councillor Burt. It feels like you're trying to solve a problem by restructuring rather than actually going to the current zone committees and going, we need to change how we operate. It just feels like it's a long journey to get to somewhere where it's very similar to what we've got now, but possibly slightly different. And I just wonder whether there was a better way of doing it, but anyway.
And I think that talks to some of the kind of the regional variations, because some would say, let's just refine our existing zone committees. Others are saying, other councils and Mana Whenua are saying, we don't need that zone committee anymore. It needs to look quite different. So that's kind of what we're toying with here. So that's one of the challenges of this work.
And I think that was reflected in the different mayors' views as well. Some are in a rush to get this review through, and obviously had to time with funding and LTP and those sort of things, whereas, you know, the likes of Ashburton did their own mini review as well, didn't they? So, yeah. Anything further? Anything over here? No, Stace, you're good online? No? Awesome. So, yep, next steps are one council to go, and then paper for Mayoral Forum. Yeah.
And then we will see you after that as well at some point. Yeah, so thank you very much for time. So I really appreciate you having us. Thank you very much.
No worries, and thanks for coming down, appreciate that. Cheers, thanks. I just, it was, interesting. I think you'll all know, but Big Mike, our parking officer, you'll remember, unfortunately he's just passed away. He's a great guy. No, very much so. You wouldn't want to park in the wrong spot or use your council free parking thing in the wrong spot because you'd feel like you'd be judged. But no, he's a wonderful man, so our thoughts go out to the family, so that's it's a real shame. Mike, Big Mike, the parking meter man, so he retired from council but then worked for us part-time for a few years. So do you remember Mike? Big, you'll know. Yeah, so he's passed away.
He's a famous picture on the front of the Herald when he was chasing a shag. That was the headline, I think, and he was a big fellow with a grey beard. He was always very happy. Yes, sorry. Yes, he's just passed away in hospice, and so, moving on now, earthquake stuff. You guys keen to keep going? Yeah, I think we should. Cool, everyone's here. So, Nicole, take us through.
Thank you, and I'll finish up the day on a scintillating topic for you. I'll race through because Councillor Parker's got about 10 minutes and they're already dropping like flies around me, so here we go. Look, it's a little bit of a rinse and repeat of 23, and you've already had the earlier paper a little while ago, which we didn't speak to, so that's given you a fair amount of background. And it's just really to bring this to the fore again, but appreciating that budgets are really tight. So this is actually the lead into a start of a planning exercise to think about the next long-term plan. So it's very much the EPB register, general practice earthquake. So apologies we haven't got Jason Ellis here to talk, but he's given me a few stats just to go through. And then I just want to update you with what's on our TDC page and the buildings that we own and where we're at to with the project. So sorry, I haven't got, take you through. So on our TDC website, there actually is a page, Managing Earthquake Risk in Our Built Environment, and that has a lot of very cool information, along with, and you'll see down to the right, priority buildings, the routes and thoroughfares, of which a lot of these buildings that we deal with within council, but also for the general public, are situated on these routes that were actually set in play a number of years ago. I'm looking at Paul for what date this would have been. Okay, we'll go with that one. So anyway, there's plenty of information there, and it's backed up, obviously, with the regulatory team and via Building and Jason Ellis in regards to information. So what is an EPB, or an earthquake-prone building? It's classed as unreinforced masonry buildings that are parts of these buildings. They're pre-1976, and that's quite a key note for one element of the buildings. There's an MB methodology used to identify the buildings, Buildings can be greater at risk than other buildings. We're talking about fallen masonry, and obviously we all know what happened in Christchurch. They invariably would have a rating below 34%, and notices, those that are, will be displayed on buildings, usually at the public entranceways, where people actually are allowed to read those, and you enter then at your own risk. That is the whole point of the notice on the board. The country has various areas that are of seismic risk. We are a medium, and that has been determined by MBIE through various work that they've done up and down the country. We can't change that unless they change that. What that actually does then is determine for priority buildings or buildings of importance or on that age, the timeline that you have to actually fix them. Now, noting our medium Timaru 1st of July 22, 27 to 12.5 years, the 12.5 years has just recently had another 4 years added to it. So a number of our buildings, the clock has been ticking, and we're several years into that 12.5, but we have gained another 4 years, and those notices have been coming out from the building unit, and we've been reposting those on various buildings that we look after. So an overview of the process. So the team downstairs, they research the council records and information. They would advise building owners. They're receiving and checking assessments. They're determining buildings, the NPS rating. That will be information that's coming through from structural engineers, and it may be what we call an initial, which is a walk around the building, or a more detailed report. They're updating the National Register. Notices are attached to the buildings, and they have in the past been identifying the buildings as an on priority routes, or also if they're on a strategic route or significant thoroughfare. So when we talk about thoroughfares, this is Timaru, so there's 2 designations here. The red lines are the strategic routes. So those are routes that are taking you down to the port, where all your emergency services will be traversing. So you'll see that second route that goes down towards, not on North Street, obviously, because you drop off past the hill there and the road stops, but further down you've got that runway down into the port, because they anticipate during a major event that the loop road will actually collapse on that bridge. So they have to keep that second route open, and then you'll see the main routes sort of linking through to the highways. Anything that's in the blue, or it looks a little bit sort of nearly purple on there, those are significant thoroughfares. So these are deemed to be people movers as well as emergency services. So anything you see in the blue is have a significant amount of people that are walking around and on the street. So that's where you could have any issues. Quickly through to Temuka, you'll see it's mostly the main King Street there and a couple of crossroads. And again, you'll see that Holly Ave, where you've got the railway siding. So again, they're protecting that route and the main railway trunk line with designating that area. We've also got Pleasant Point, so the main street there, and just across on the road that just goes up towards the school, because that actually houses the local fire emergency service. So they're making sure that the fire trucks, etc., can actually get out from these establishments and move around. And then you've got the Geraldine, which is very, very similar. It goes right the way through the main street, and then a couple of the thoroughfares along Cox and Wilson, and a little bit of Peel there. But that's because it's around the main supermarket, and the thoroughfare is actually for people movement in that area. No, there has been no increase to these routes since they were actually designated some time ago, and we've just done a little bit of work to try and understand how we may be able to, say, step back from some of these routes, and there's a bit of a process involved in doing that. You have to demonstrate, though I don't know what the criteria is to demonstrate your strategic route, your people movement, etc., but certainly your priority routes. It could be very interesting if they're still supporting. So, I don't think we're going to be able to get to change them, but certainly we can look at challenging them. But then we've got to ask ourselves, looking at the routes that are noted, whether we should. A couple of stats from Jason for you, and this is based on me and Nigel's request. The total buildings that are registered as earthquake prone across the district are 313. 242 in Timaru, 41 in Temuka, 23 in Geraldine, and 7 in Pleasant Point. Now, the seismic work underway for building consents, and these numbers are going to shock you a little bit. 2023, there were 11 issued, 4 reached CCC, 3 were in Timaru, 1 was in Geraldine. 2024, 11 issued, 3 reached CCC, Timaru 1, Temuka 1, Geraldine 1. So in summary, total registered 313, work underway 23-24, 22, Triple C issued, 23-24, only 7. Now that is not taking into account 2025. So this includes some of our buildings, obviously. So if you take that as well as the public sector, we're not addressing the issue, and certainly the public sector isn't. So that is something to be aware of as we step forward. So TDC earthquake buildings, this is again just bringing you up to date with the project. We've a little bit of background, which is the definition of what is earthquake prone. We've been through some of that, and the property team have been leading this project for a number of years, and it was already in play when I arrived here. So it has been a continuum of actually looking at doing detailed assessments where required, and we've caught up on a lot of that work in recently looking at some of the big projects. And as we said, it's not an exact science. Each building is unique in the way it's constructed and when, and assessments are carried out by registered structural engineers and governed by the Building Earthquake Prone Buildings Amendment Act 2016. They have an identifying priority list. So again, it's emergency response, high Eustace, TDC notice or identified as earthquake prone, and it's run through a likelihood and consequences. There's a assessment note there. What we've actually undertaken internally for our buildings that are either leased out or that we have a number of people obviously in the public coming and going, this was an assessment carried out by a group of people, and I've left all of the logos across the bottom, purposely commissioned to create a decision framework for whether a building should remain open if it's actually owned and managed by council. So we run through a building assessment with a group of yes or no's, and the main criteria here is the length of time that people spend within a building and how many people are within a building. If anybody wants any further detail on this and some of the examples of the buildings, then I'm quite happy to spend that time, come and see me for half an hour. I'll come and find you and I'll step you through what that means. But from a risk perspective, this is actually gives us something to put on record that allows us to demonstrate that we've thought about this building, we anticipate how many people, how many hours, and the risk of leaving that building open, which also then means we're not arbitrarily just closing buildings. We actually have a robust process that we've gone through for that building to remain open. Project to date, we've done a mixture of, it has been a mixture of ISAs and DSA, so that's initial assessment. We've got, the building department has issued earthquake prone building notices. As we've noticed, the clock is ticking, depending on the assessments, but identified under the 34 MBS rating, and government has extended those timelines for priority buildings by another 4 years. Currently, we've got a budget of 1 million, which has been carried forward from last year, and that's been finishing off some of those reports and looking at some construction for one building in Temuka. We've identified priority buildings, we've got notices, we know the ones that are high usage, and we know for emergency response. We're starting to receive quotes and action on the DSAs across a number of those buildings. A few have been built. There is quite a number that we still need to work through. And this is why, looking forward to the next LTP, these are the next steps. It should be a strategic review of the property assets. And when we say property here, I have only brought to you buildings that are currently in the property department and in the recreation department, but that is not the full quantum of buildings across council. So if we're talking about the built environment or we're talking about car parks, there are quite a number of other buildings that could be added to this list. And so there has to be a decision of how wide, when you say property, is that right across TDC's property assets, determine the OPEX, the CAPEX and the replacement plan. What do you want to do with them? Because OPEX and CAPEX are dovetailed here, because obviously there's depreciation issues. Once you've fixed all these buildings up, then they come back on your register. OPEX will increase. You will have some things triggered by the Building Act once you start to do some of this work. So it's quite a big body of work that needs to be undertaken. You're identifying from each of the DSA's recommendations to bring the buildings, and I would suggest you do a stage approach. You've got to get them up over the 34. Some it may take very little extra work to actually bring them up to a 67, but at least have a plan that brings them to 34, and that gets them off your insurance indemnity and gives you full cover again if you would want it or require it. And then you've got the next steps. Your notices are removed, the clock has stopped ticking, but then do you actually work on how you step them forward to 67? And then you're linking each recommendation to the list on the AMPs, what we call the asset management plans that come up to you each year. And then also the building asset plans to target OPEX and CAPEX on the priority spend. And if you're looking across council, then you can look at the priority buildings that you have, which ones are the most important, which ones have got big people movement, which ones have got the big dollars attached to any possible repairs. So very quickly, that is an update of where we're at with the notices, which ones are on the priority route, what percentages and notices issued. And as I said, the notices are starting to come out with an increase of 4 years on a lot of the priority routes and the priority buildings. And then you've got some of the non-priority repairs, which have got a longer time for fix. And you would then decide whether you wanted to actually look at those buildings. And then obviously we've got the Community and Recreation Department buildings there, of which the major pools, though they don't fall into the category to be reviewed from an ISA or DSA, at some point in the future you may wish to have a look at the Main Sea Bay pool or the other pools. For now, we looked at the Temuka Service Library building because that one has been noted on a priority route and it is pre-1976. The Arangi Stadium because of the works that you're currently doing there. South Canterbury Museum, again because of the current projects underway. And the Timaru Library because that was actually thought about for projects last year. So to code, you've got your Geraldine Service and Library Centre and your Egantai House now, which will come off that list. So that is all of the buildings. That's the end of the quick overview of the workshop. And I just don't know if there's any questions from elected members.
Just on the Temuka one, we did do some work on that, didn't we? Did we tie back the parapets or something on the frontages or something? There was.
That was a Pleasant Point.
No,
So-
there wasn't.
We did a little bit of work on the Temuka one, yes. Yeah, it's again, it's because of the priority route that you're caught up in the timeline. And we have done a little bit of work on the Pleasant Point, but there are some parapet works to finish there for that main town hall building.
Questions, and then I'll go to...
I guess I'm worried, Nicole, the $1 million we've got aside probably won't pay for DSAs on all the buildings we own. And the second point is, I'm also concerned, it's great that you've got what's under your control, but I'm worried in the other departments what major buildings there are that may need work within the 12.5 years we've got left.
Yeah. And I think that's really now the question over this next year of how you wish to widen the scope of this and have the other departments work in. We have a lot of information. I know Andrew has information on some of his buildings, certainly Sophia Car Park, etc. But you could actually look to widen the scope and bring that information in. We do have info. A lot of DSAs have been completed, but some of the bigger buildings, they're quite expensive, and then you've just got to decide how much of that work you want to do. Yeah.
So when you say a lot of the DSAs have been completed, it would have been handy to have a column to know which ones we've done and which we haven't done. And I guess too, as a council, we've got to look at the usage of some of these buildings, some halls, whether there's other options. And I take the Geraldine Movie Theatre, is it better to build new? There's some real decisions we need to make around that.
Yeah.
And I kind of feeling we're sitting on our hands along with the rest of the community. This is going to be a big thing when in 7 years' time when everyone's only got 5 years left?
So,
I agree, but we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 on priority routes.
and there are two, I mean, there's, I know there's still work to go through, and there is the drilling work, et cetera, report that we'll still receive at some point. And the other thing is, and can't speak to lots of detail because we're still in that process, but I'm on that steering group for seismic assessment, et cetera, and at a point in time, there's going to be new legislation. So what that exactly means for all this, that will come through. And I think, you know, what I'm hopeful is there'll be some pragmatism come through it. Yeah.
Yeah, I think I would agree with Mayor Nigel. There is change in the wind. Whether there's going to be any change to the medium status of the area, I don't know, but certainly Wellington and other areas are driving what's happening in this earthquake-prone space. There are a lot of buildings around the country. It's not just Timaru that has a lot of these older buildings caught up in this. So, you know, where do we go with this? I think that change is coming. And we've got a lot of really good information, but it is linked to that larger strategic picture around buildings overall and what your portfolios and how you're going to step forward about your priorities. Yeah.
Go for it. No.
Thank you. Sorry, Nicole, my apologies if I missed this while you were explaining it, but it's been a long day. So I just wanted to find out how we got from level 1, how you then decide whether or not it goes to level 2 or level 3 that then takes you on to the next step. So when you get to level 1, what are the big decisions there around whether or not it stays at level 1 or moves to level 2 or level 3? Sorry if I missed that before.
Oh, sorry, I'm just going to get to that page for you so I can talk through that. Just a moment. So part of and I'm assuming you mean the Managing Earthquake-Prone Council buildings. Yep. So there are a series of questions that have been developed, and there's actually a check sheet. And on that check sheet, there are some matrix boxes of which you put, are you in a medium area, and do you have a building that is deemed on a priority route, et cetera, et cetera. And then it drops down and tells you which one of these you go to. And if you hit the button where you say yes, and it's saying, is the building less than 34%, et cetera, then you move across to the next step. In step 2, then you there's another series of questions that you're asked that take you through this matrix of 1, 2, or 3. And again, depending on, if you get to series 1, that question is the building remains open. It's less than 34, but it's got a 27-year repair on it. It may not be on a priority route, et cetera, and it remains open.
So nothing is left to subjectivity, is it?
The whole of this is a subject. It's the whole of earthquake-prone building, and even a structural engineer can attest to that, and I'm looking at one sitting in the room who may nod his head. It is not an exact science. And when we actually go through the steps here, nobody can ultimately tell you yes or no about a building. A building is perfectly fine to be occupied. It is what would happen in the event of an earthquake, but we don't know what that earthquake is going to be.
So then if we've decided to keep a building open, right, and God forbid, we do get the big quake or whatever, then whose responsibility, I mean, is there any responsibility on our shoulders for leaving that building open?
The responsibility lies all over the place in this, and it sort of depends. Now, if we have not done one of these risk assessments and popped this on file, then we could have been deemed to have not thought about how many people are occupying a building if it falls within an earthquake-prone notification of a building.
You've got an audit trail that
And this
you've
is
done the things.
Yeah, and this is the paper trail, and this is why using this particular one that has been developed by Brands, it has been tested by a group of quite eminent and scientific people in this world that are developed it's a pipeline of checklists, and then you do have to make a decision as a group. And so us internally, we have our chief executive sits on the group, manager of building, so Jason, who sits on the group, myself, health and safety. We also have our people and capability, so there's and myself, and then any other subject expert that could be available. So we have got the offer of a structural engineer if we would like one, and commentary. So we actually do have a group of us that test our thinking when we work our way through this particular suite of questions. Yeah. It's reasonably simple, but there is some very subjective questions in there which really rely on a group of people having a good conversation and therefore testing our thinking about why we're going yes or no on something. Yeah.
Do we mention those geotechnical tests that we were doing?
Mm-hmm.
So, sorry if I missed this again, but when do we get the results on those, the testing that's been done locally?
So the first part of the review of all the information without the actual testing behind the library has been completed, and that is currently out with the wider group of engineers and others involved in that for review. They have come back with some commentary for the professor that has been handling that review, and they've put forward some further tests which were outlined by the reviewer. But the rest of that information, it is with him at the moment, so I will follow that up. But we should be, I keep saying we should get that in the next week or two. We are due to have that information. It is a bit late. Yeah. It's more the reviewer that's doing that information. So, yeah. So I will chase that up again, and yeah. We were told it would take a couple of months for that information to go through all of the various tests. So we'll.
So what's the best case scenario from that testing? What can we hope? What's the best thing we can hope for?
I think what some are hoping for would be an understanding, and the basis for a lot of buildings and how much you repair them and to what standard you repair them, therefore the cost associated, is linked to a subsoil classification. That's the soil that the buildings stand on and how it's going to behave in an earthquake. And we've had some reports by various people within the community who are structural engineers and geotech engineers that say that some of our subsoil should be B, which is actually a good classification. Now, I've done work with geotech engineers on some of the buildings, including this one, for the land areas around it, which is telling me and advised to be C, D, and in some cases D, which sort of makes it tougher and a lot stricter, and it brings your percentage down, and you've got a higher bar to climb to get up to over your 34. So this work is to determine an understanding of a subsoil classification for the Timaru CBD, and that's why it's going to take a little time, and it's quite thorough because it has to be very well thought through, and that information, if it's to be relied on by structural engineers, really must have gone through several good process steps that people can rely on that information. So that's really what we're going through now.
So once we get that, that's not the end of the story.
No.
Apparently there are some other tests that we need to do, and for whatever reason, those tests weren't done on this situation, so they're going to be done. I'm not technical, so don't ask me what they are. So they're going to get done to actually help inform where we're at.
Yeah. There's a difference between how we've tested down to 60 metres, and there's a difference between how the subsoil will behave depending on how tightly packed it is or how loose it is, or gravel river. So you think about liquefaction, etc. So we're trying to really find something that is solid or is rock, because that's going to give you a better outcome. And Timaru has got quite a mixture of, it would appear, those compounds, yes. So the extra work is actually looking at something below 3 metres, so it's sort of near the surface, But then we've also got all this work that's going down to quite a depth, because there are different resonances of what will happen depending on the earthquake as it comes up through the soil mass. I think that's about as technical as I'm going to go.
Simply put, OJ, there's a number of people that are under 34%, they're earthquake prone. If the soil moves from D to B, they'll be fine, they won't have to spend a cent. And without pointing at the engineers, I've got a building in Timaru where the owner got 2 reports, one said 20%, the other said 68.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So it's, you know, in the
So, yeah.
eye of the beholder
Yeah.
in some ways.
Yeah, so part of the report is recommending that you shouldn't at this stage call something B unless you've done a dig right there on that building and established that it's actually a B, or established it's a C, or established it's a D. So I think that is something that will come out of this report. It's still very site-specific. Otherwise, engineers really struggle to pin the tail on the donkey.
But Stu, a question for you, I know the answer, but as far as, you know, one thing that we can do for the CBD, this bit of work, as far as them being able to lease a building if it does come out at B.
Oh, look, it'd be wonderful news for all those Edwardian facades, you know.
Yeah.
Be fantastic. People would be dancing.
Yeah. Okay.
I have a couple of questions.
Yep, Stace, jump in.
It would have been handy in the table, we've got feedback there.
No, you're all good. We're okay if you.
Yep.
Oh, that's better. In the table, when the notice was issued, the date, so we had some idea around the timeframes to deliver those. I see most of the property, the priority ones, we hopefully will be dealing with a lot of those over the next sort of 12 to 18 months. So for example, your Criterion, Chinese Gardens, theatres. So that's quite positive. But my question is, who's pulling together all the other properties into the table? Because obviously this is just, Nicole, your department, but who is actually pulling the rest of the properties into the tables? That's the first question. And then any of the buildings needing to be strengthened in the next LTP, and do we have a value on that? Like as in, do we need to be putting $5 million aside, etc.?
It's too early for the LTP, so we will get the list of all buildings into a table. I'm not sure we can afford to do all the DSAs, so you'll get a list of here are the buildings. Here's maybe an initial high-level assessment from our own staff, but that's all you'll get.
So at the
So
moment,
for the next LTP though, won't we need to start putting some money aside to deal with it?
Well, it's a year away yet, so we've got plenty of time.
so the point of the paper previously in the workshop is to pop it on your radar, and certainly for the next council to start to think about what this is. So there's a bit of a strategy to go around this, and the decision for Nigel is how he wishes this, it could expand the project with the property team, or several different departments work together and take it forward in regards to the extra buildings on a list here.
Yeah, of course you can.
So when you look at the major buildings, we know we're doing up the theatre, so it's going to be taken care of. Potentially, we're going to build a new museum, so that's taken care of. I understand the Timaru Library, the cost of that is not high, so that'll get taken care of. Then you're into actually looking at buildings we haven't done a detailed review yet, so those will then come up with what's next. And I'm assuming we're going to have to bring a paper to council to say, what order you want them to do in? Which of the buildings do you think are most significant?
Stacey, anything else from you, mate?
No, that's good, thank you.
Awesome. Alrighty, nothing further. Thank you, Nicole. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Been a long day, so thank you for everyone's attention to the meetings and workshops, and we'll close off. Thank you.